Alright, everybody, and we are back today talking about our second team in the NFC North, none other than the Detroit Lions. So, to give a little bit of background here on Detroit, just see where we're coming from with the Lions. The Detroit Lions are a team that is certainly on the rise in 2023, but they have not made the postseason since the 2016 season. That was back, of course, when they still had Matthew Stafford at the helm. Completely different team from the unit we'll be seeing on the field in 2023. And if you really want to go back, the Lions also possess the longest postseason wins drought. So as we go down here, they have not won a playoff game since 1991. And as a matter of fact, they haven't won the NFC North at all since the division has been, as it's been currently constructed, since 2002, the last time the NFL realigned. All three of these instances in 2011, 2014, and 2016, the Lions made it in as a wild card team. So that also means the Detroit faithful themselves, the Lions fans, haven't been able to see a home playoff game since the 1990s. As crazy as that is to think about. So, entire generation of Lions fans that haven't seen a home playoff game. But certainly looks as though they are poised to change that this year. But before we talk about the 2023 Lions, let's look at this 2022 team because this was a unit that showed substantial improvement from the 2021 season where they finished with the second worst record. So looking at the 2022 Lions, they're coached by, of course, Dan Campbell in his second season. And some of the standouts with this team last year certainly was the offense, which this was absolutely a top 5 unit in the National Football League last year. Finished in 5th place in terms of points scored, and they ranked 4th in terms of total yards accumulated on offense, as well as being first in team turnovers lost. So they turned the ball over the fewest amount of times out of any team in the National Football League, which is certainly something of encouragement going forward with the Detroit Lions. And looking further down here, though, that is certainly offset by their defense, which was right near the bottom of the National Football League in 2022. They were ranked 28th in terms of points scored, or I guess points allowed, I should say, and they did allow the most yards out of any defense in the National Football League. So despite the fact that their offense was very impressive last year, their defense really wasn't doing them any favors. So looking at their schedule, that is certainly reflected as we see these games here. Week 1 against the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles did end up winning the NFC last year, both in terms of best record in the regular season and emerging victorious in the NFC Championship game, but Detroit put up a really good fight against them week 1. They end up with putting up 35 points against the Philadelphia Eagles, but they allow 38, so they end up losing in a shootout, and that seems to be a trend for Detroit, especially early on in the season here. But what really stood out to me about this 2022 Lions team was they begin the season 1-6, but then go on to finish the season with, over the next 10 games from week 9 onward, they finish with an 8-2 record. Very impressive, certainly seem to figure things out as we flip the calendar to November, because from that point on, they only lose 2 games, and those 2 games were to, one of them was to the Buffalo Bills, which they only lost by 3 points, and the other one was to the Carolina Panthers, which really the only ugly loss in there, but can't win them all, right? So some of the other things that I thought were of note with this Detroit Lions unit, their offense ranked 4th in terms of red zone percentage last year. Certainly another sign of encouragement for this team. Jared Goff was a big reason why. He certainly had a return to form back to his Los Angeles Rams days. Starts all 17 games for the Detroit Lions. As we say, the best ability is availability. And Jared Goff finishes with 4,400 yards through the air, 29 passing touchdowns to just 7 interceptions. So certainly love to see that if you're a Detroit Lions fan. And moving forward, we'll look at some of the other statistics here. Don't really need to waste too much time on the rushing and receiving. Jamal Williams did have a monster season, but as we'll see in a minute, he's no longer with the Detroit Lions. Same with DeAndre Swift, who certainly impressed when he was on the field, but did struggle to stay on the field. He's no longer with the Detroit Lions either. Then looking at the receiving statistics, Amon-Ra St. Brown certainly has established himself as one of the premier wide receivers in the National Football League. In just his, I believe this was his second season last year. He'll be in his third season this year. So definitely in terms of the elite receivers in the NFL, he doesn't really get mentioned a lot, but he's quietly been very consistent for Detroit during his time there. But beyond him, really not too much doing at receiver, but Detroit is aware of this, and as we look at their offseason, we'll see how they attempt to rectify this. Moving along to the defense now, we'll look at some notable players here, really three notable rookies that I want to point out. Of course, Aiden Hutchinson is going to be the star on this defense. Started all 17 games last year. He was the number 2 overall selection in the 2022 draft. Grew up in Michigan, went to the University of Michigan, so he gets to stay at home close to his family. He's definitely motivated to help turn this Lions franchise around. So he ends up with 9.5 sacks as a rookie, another 3 interceptions, 2 fumble recoveries, 15 quarterback hits, 9 tackles for a loss. Very, very encouraging stuff for a young man just at the age of 22. So some of the other rookies I did want to point out were James Houston, who only plays in 7 games, but ends up with 8 sacks himself, and a forced fumble, a fumble recovery, and 11 quarterback hits as well. And then finally wanted to look at Kirby Joseph, another rookie last year at only age 22. Playing safety for the Detroit Lions, he starts 14 games and is able to accumulate 4 interceptions, and 2 forced fumbles, and plus a fumble recovery. So Detroit certainly has some players on this defense to build around. It's not as if it's a completely lost cause, despite the fact that they were one of the worst ranked defenses in the NFL last year. They have young talent there, and certainly Detroit is looking to build around that. So on that note, we will turn the page to Detroit's 2023 offseason. What did the Lions do in free agency? Oh, I will give a quick shout out as well before we proceed that Frank Ragnow, Penei Sewell, Jared Goff, and Amon-Ra St. Brown all earned Pro Bowl honors last year, so congratulations to those gentlemen. We'll start off with not the Broncos, that was the last video, starting off with the Lions' departures. So just to recap here, this column here shows what team the players were on in 2022. On the right, what team they are now on in 2023. And over here, what percentage of snaps they played for their 2022 squad. And of course, if you're just listening to this video, I will fill you in on all the notable additions and subtractions right now. So starting off with the subtractions for the Detroit Lions, I will mention number 3 overall pick, former number 3 overall pick, Jeffrey Okudah, selected 3rd overall in the 2020 draft. Certainly a notable selection because he was taken ahead of franchise quarterbacks such as Tua Tagovailoa and Justin Herbert, who went just a couple selections later, and even some other standout players like CeeDee Lamb or Justin Jefferson, who would go later on in the first round. But Jeffrey Okudah really just didn't work out with the Lions, which is unfortunate to see. Detroit really could have used that help in the secondary, as we saw last season, but they decide to cut ties with Jeff Okudah after just 3 seasons, and he finds himself down in Atlanta after playing nearly 70% of snaps last season. So, as I said in the Atlanta video, I hope he lands on his feet and can really get his career back on the right track, because you just want to see the guy succeed. It's a shame for somebody who is a top 3 pick that he's already on a new team after just 3 seasons. Didn't even get to finish out his rookie deal, but some other notable losses here. We'll mention both the running backs yet again. DeAndre Swift gets traded to the Philadelphia Eagles for a late round draft selection, and Jamal Williams moves on to greener pastures with the New Orleans Saints, signing as a free agent. So Detroit's certainly going to have to fill a void at the running back position as well, which we will see later on that they certainly do. They do lose another player in the secondary as well, also to the Atlanta Falcons, going with Jeff Okudah. Mike Hughes signs with them as a free agent after playing pretty close to 50% of snaps for Detroit last season. So I will also mention a few other players here. Actually, we'll stay in the secondary real quick as well. They lose Amani Arawari to the New York Giants, who played 42% of snaps for them last season. But honestly, even though they do lose technically three cornerbacks here to free agency, that's not the worst thing in the world considering this defense was pretty poor, especially in the secondary last year. So turnover isn't the worst thing in the world at all for this unit. And they do lose another player in the secondary, this time at the safety position. This being Deshaun Elliott, played 76% of snaps last season for Detroit. He moves on to the Miami Dolphins. So Detroit really, besides Kirby Joseph, seems to really be turning the page on their secondary, which, like I said, completely understandable given the circumstances of the 2022 Lions. So then one more player I will mention here is Evan Brown, a center who played 67% of snaps last season. He moves on to the Seattle Seahawks, but as we'll see when we look at the Lions depth chart, they really are in a really solid spot on the offensive line, so I'm not too concerned with that. Now looking at some of the additions for the Detroit Lions this season. So we'll start off down here. They bring in Cameron Sutton from the Pittsburgh Steelers. He definitely figures to be their number one cornerback this season, and definitely a good move for Detroit to bring some stability to that secondary. They're able to open up the bank account to pay Cameron Sutton, and definitely should be a move that will help them out. And they don't stop there, though, because they also bring in Emmanuel Mosley from the San Francisco 49ers. He played just 29% of snaps for the 49ers last season, but that's because he tore his ACL in October of 2022. So he is currently on the PUP list, but he definitely figures to be a key contributor once he comes back healthy and ready to go. So they do add one more notable player in the secondary, and that is C.J. Gardner-Johnson, or Chauncey Gardner-Johnson Jr., if you will, of the Philadelphia Eagles last year, prior to that of the New Orleans Saints. Just speaking as an Eagles fan, C.J. Gardner-Johnson was a huge part of what the Eagles were able to do last year, so definitely love that move for Detroit. He will certainly be missed in Philadelphia despite um, his smack talk against Eagles fans since he has departed to the Lions, but have to respect what he's given us on the field. And he's only age 26. He's still a young man by all means. So look forward to seeing what he can do in this new look Detroit secondary. He could play either the nickel corner or the safety position for them. So certainly gives them some flexibility. And they also bring in a former Detroit Lion, Marvin Jones, this time at wide receiver. He was originally with Detroit, well, I believe he was originally with Cincinnati, then with Detroit, before going to Jacksonville over the last couple seasons, and now he is back with Detroit at age 33. So Marvin Jones definitely figures to be somebody who could give Jared Goff another steady weapon besides Amon-Ra St. Brown. And as we will see in a second, they do still have Jameson Williams, but Jameson Williams is going to be off the field for the first month and a half or so of the season due to a suspension, which is quite ironic because he was suspended for gambling when it seems the NFL's biggest sponsors these days are all just gambling companies. So love to see the double standard there with the NFL, but nothing really new. So one more player I will mention before we proceed is Graham Glasgow. We did mention him in the Denver Broncos video. He departs from Denver to Detroit. Played 81% of snaps for Denver last season at right guard. He's age 31, and he definitely will play a role on this Detroit Lions offense, although Detroit does have a very strong unit on the offensive line, so he might even see a little bit of competition as we take a look at the depth chart in a minute. But before we do that, we'll look over Detroit's 2023 draft. So this was definitely a head-scratching draft, looking at it from definitely from my perspective, but I know a lot of NFL fans and people in the media have certainly agreed with that sentiment. So Detroit coming into this draft was really in a fortunate position. They had the number 5 overall selection by way of the Los Angeles Rams, who had a very poor season last year coming off of their Super Bowl win, but they still owed their 2023 first round pick to the Detroit Lions for the Matthew Stafford trade. So Detroit was in possession of the number 6 overall pick, and there were certainly some talented players on the board there. You had options like Tyree Wilson, Jalen Carter to help out that defensive line. Could have taken Christian Gonzalez to help solidify that secondary, though I understand the scars of Jeff Okudah in the top 10 are still pretty fresh, so maybe that scared them off from taking another cornerback so high. But Detroit ends up trading back from 6 to the 12th overall selection. Now, there was a trade prior to that as well, a couple trades with the number 12 selection. The number 12 selection originally belonged to the Cleveland Browns, but they traded it to the Houston Texans as part of the Deshaun Watson deal. Then Houston turned around and traded that selection to the Arizona Cardinals to move up to the number 3 overall selection to select Will Anderson. But following that up, the Arizona Cardinals, now in possession of the 12th pick, then moved up with Detroit to number 6 overall to select, I believe it was Paris Johnson, the offensive tackle. So Detroit falls back down to the number 12 overall selection, where they take running back Jahmyr Gibbs. And this is certainly a head scratcher as well, because if Detroit was set on taking a running back, Bijan Robinson was there at 6th overall. He ends up going 8th overall to the Atlanta Falcons. But I think the biggest thing with this Jahmyr Gibbs pick, and then even at 18 with Jack Campbell, Detroit certainly likes both of these players, and that's perfectly okay, but running back and linebacker really aren't positions that are valued league-wide, and I certainly believe that if Detroit wanted to, they could have probably selected Jahmyr Gibbs at the 18th overall selection, and there's a very good chance Jack Campbell would have been there at the 34th overall selection. Of course, we don't know that for certain, so if Detroit really did love these two players, don't really judge them for jumping on that opportunity to bring them onto their roster, but certainly could have added them later on potentially and grabbed another difference maker with either the 12th overall selection or just stayed at number 6 and taken one of the other elite players that were available up there. But just interesting to look at. And I do think as we go along here, we'll see what Detroit was thinking when they made these selections. So they do also select, they double down on the University of Alabama and the University of Iowa twice here. So they go Alabama, Iowa, Iowa, Alabama. Their next two picks after their first round selection, both of their second round selections are, initially we have Sam Laporta, the tight end out of Iowa, teammate of Jack Campbell in the University of Iowa, and then Brian Branch, defensive back from the University of Alabama, teammate of Jahmyr Gibbs. I do love that Brian Branch pick. He is somebody who definitely could have been a first round selection. And again, this is another instance of safety is a position that really isn't valued too much league-wide right now. So, especially at the NFL draft, you don't see a ton of safeties go in the first round. So, Detroit was patient and was able to get Brian Branch at the 45th overall selection here. And as a Philadelphia Eagles fan, I was certainly intrigued by Brian Branch because a lot of the scouting reports suggested he plays a very similar game to C.J. Gardner-Johnson and could play more of that high safety role or potentially a nickel corner. So I liked him as a potential replacement for C.J. Gardner-Johnson, but Detroit ends up with both of them, so certainly will help turn their secondary around. And then in the third round, they draft Hendon Hooker, who is a quarterback who received a ton of media hype leading up to the draft as somebody who could potentially even skyrocket to a late first round selection, but when we actually got there on draft weekend, he ends up going in round 3 to Detroit. So like that pick for Detroit, it gives them a little bit of a development project behind Jared Goff in case they do want to turn the page from him over the next couple seasons, but he's kind of just hanging out in the background right now. So with that being said, let's see how Detroit puts this all together on the depth chart. So looking at Detroit's depth chart, certainly a lot going on here. We have our fair share of position battles, and of course, as I will mention with all of these at this point in the season, none of this is official as of right now. All of these names are simply penciled in, if you will, at these positions. So a lot could still change. But as of right now, I'd say this is a good general idea of how things will shake out. Oh, and I forgot to mention too with the acquisitions, they bring in David Montgomery from the Chicago Bears. Did mention him in the Bears video, but absolutely love that pickup for the Detroit Lions. So looking now at the Lions depth chart, start at the quarterback position. They have Jared Goff, of course, slated to be their starting quarterback. Don't really see too much of a debate there. Then they do have Teddy Bridgewater backing him up, who they brought in from Miami. And Teddy Bridgewater, as most people likely know, he's been in the NFL for quite a bit now. This will be his 10th season, but he's made a very successful career as somebody who can certainly step in and be an effective starting quarterback if called upon, but in a backup role, I would say he is certainly one of the premier backups in the National Football League. If Teddy Bridgewater is your backup, I would feel very confident about having stability at the quarterback position. If Jared Goff were to, God forbid, go down with an injury, I don't think this offense will miss too much of a beat with Teddy Bridgewater stepping in. They are definitely in safe hands. So looking at the rest of this depth chart at quarterback, Hendon Hooker currently on the non-football injury-related list, so he did not play in their first preseason game. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Lions starters on offense didn't play in the preseason game last week. Nate Sudfeld ended up getting the start at quarterback, but I'd be interested to see if Nate Sudfeld even ends up making the roster when all is said. When all is said and done, because they do have three quarterbacks ahead of him on the depth chart here. Who you have your starter in Jared Goff, you have your steady backup in Teddy Bridgewater, and then your third-round pick in Hendon Hooker, who definitely figures to be a part of the Lions' big picture at the quarterback position. So I certainly see Hendon Hooker being somebody who, even if he doesn't eventually become a replacement for Jared Goff, he could certainly be the backup after this season if Teddy Bridgewater decides to depart. So I don't know if Detroit ends up carrying four quarterbacks on the roster, is my point there. Moving along to the running back spot, we have the dynamic duo here of David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, first round pick. So this is what I mean when I say I start to understand what Detroit's doing on with their draft selections. So while they did lose DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams last year, they bring in David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, and honestly, you could say somehow they might have even upgraded their running back position, which is certainly a strong asset for this team, as we'll look at with the rest of this offense. A great running game would certainly be of tremendous importance for them if they want to maintain that offensive success from last season. So David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, I imagine, will handle the running back duties in more of a tandem fashion, although some of the players down the depth chart here could certainly be competing to make the roster. I don't think too many of them will end up receiving a noticeable number of snaps, I should say, once the regular season begins. This is certainly a two-headed monster, if you will, in the backfield. And we'll just give a footnote on the quarterback position. There is technically an open competition for this backup spot with Teddy Bridgewater, Hendon Hooker, and Nate Sudfeld, although I do believe this is Teddy Bridgewater's job to lose at this point, and the depth chart will play out as such. Nate Sudfeld did get the start, as I mentioned, in the preseason game last week, but did not impress by any stretch of the imagination, so certainly diminishes any hopes he had of making this roster. Good to see him hanging around in the NFL, though. He was the third man on that 2017 Eagles depth chart when they won the Super Bowl behind, of course, Carson Wentz and Nick Foles. Looking now at the tight end position, do have a camp battle going on here as well between Sam Laporta and Brock Wright. I will say, while Sam Laporta does still have the inside track to win this starting job, he did not impress at all in the first preseason game, so I think that's worth noting, but I still do believe Sam Laporta will end up winning this job when all is said and done, and he will be one of Jared Goff's primary weapons as we get into the regular season. So looking now at the wide receiver spot, speaking of weapons, we do have Amon-Ra St. Brown, of course, the third-year player, initially drafted in the fourth round, who really has become a standout player for Detroit and absolutely a shining example of great scouting on Detroit's part to be able to pick him up in the fourth round. Right behind him figures to be Marvin Jones as the number 2 receiver, although, like we mentioned earlier, Jameson Williams should slot in alongside him and could potentially snag that number 2 job and end up number 2 in targets on the team by the end of the season, although he is suspended for the first 6 games of the season. So with that being said, I'm sure these players will be battling out for the number 4 receiver, number 5 receiver role. You have the rookie Antoine Green, drafted in the 7th round this season. Denzel Mims, former 2nd round pick of the New York Jets, and Josh Reynolds, formerly of the Tennessee Titans, certainly figured to be in the mix for Detroit there. Finally, on the offensive side of the ball, we'll look at this offensive line, and this truly is one of the premier units in the National Football League, and really is the main reason why this Detroit Lions offense was as successful as it was last year. I would say this is firmly a top 5 unit in the National Football League. I would put them right up there with units like Cleveland and Baltimore that we've mentioned already. And I would honestly even put them ahead of units like Dallas and Atlanta, who I also have a lot of confidence in that we've mentioned already. So a big reason for that is because Detroit has stability at both tackle positions, which really, when you want to build a steady, stable, and effective offensive line, it all starts for me, I believe, at the tackle positions. That really can, if you're able to get that foundation set, it's able to give your quarterback better pockets, give him more time, and it's able to really set up the running game as well. So they have Taylor Decker, their 1st round pick from 2016, at the left tackle spot. Really one of the more underrated left tackles, I would say, in the NFL. He really doesn't seem to get his due, but he's just been a steady force for them since they drafted him back in 2016. And then on the other side, they have Penei Sewell, who was drafted just 2 seasons ago. And Penei Sewell was one of those players who really had a lot of hype around him going into that 2021 draft and was seen as somebody who probably would have been the next the best non-quarterback in that draft class. That was, of course, the year where quarterbacks go 1, 2, and 3, Trevor Lawrence, Zach Wilson, and Trey Lance. Then 4th overall was Kyle Pitts to the Atlanta Falcons. Jamar Chase goes 5th. Jalen Waddle goes 6th. And then I believe Penei Sewell goes 7th. So teams in the top 6 all double down on the skill positions, and some of them, like the Jacksonville Jaguars with Trevor Lawrence, are certainly happy with their selection. Same with the Cincinnati Bengals and Miami Dolphins selecting Jamar Chase and Jalen Waddle respectively, but I'm sure the New York Jets, looking back, especially now that they have Aaron Rodgers, they would love to have Penei Sewell on the roster instead of Zach Wilson. Same with the San Francisco 49ers with Brock Purdy. Perhaps they would rather have Penei Sewell than Trey Lance. And you could even say with the Atlanta Falcons, though their offensive line is pretty exceptional still, perhaps they'd even consider Penei Sewell over Kyle Pitts. Though in Atlanta's case, I'd say the hindsight is more passing up on Jamar Chase and Jalen Waddle. But hindsight's always 2020. We can't turn back the clock. Detroit, I think, got a really solid value pick there with Penei Sewell, and he's been everything they could ask of him and more. So they've had fantastic stability at these tackle positions. Then even on the interior of this offensive line, they continue to have standout players as well. Frank Ragnow, their number 1 selection in 2018, has been holding down the center of this offensive line ever since. Then they have Jonah Jackson, a 4th-year player at left guard. And there is a competition going on at this right guard spot between Graham Glasgow, the free agent addition, and Halapoulivaati Vaitai, formerly of the Philadelphia Eagles. He can play both tackle and guard, so if I had to make a knee-jerk prediction now, I would say Graham Glasgow does hold on to this starting position, just because Big V, as we will call him, is somebody who could step in really for any position besides the center spot if an injury were to occur. I think Detroit, much like as we mentioned with the Buffalo Bills video with their offensive line situation, having somebody who can play multiple positions is certainly more advantageous to have as a reserve rather than a starter. So I think ultimately the depth chart, when all is said and done, will look very similar to this as listed. So all in all, a very impressive offensive unit for Detroit. I think they are certainly primed for more success on the offensive side of the ball this year, especially adding a veteran like Marvin Jones, adding two new running backs to the fold, and honestly, I think upgrading that running back position. They drafted a new tight end to replace TJ Hawkinson, who they removed at the trade deadline last season, and they bring in a little more agility for their offensive line here. So definitely like what Detroit's done. Moving on to their defense. So Detroit on defense does have. They were a poor unit last year, as we know, and there's certainly a lot of room for improvement. But as we mentioned, they have a lot of things to be encouraged about here for sure. So Aiden Hutchinson's really where it's all going to start here on the defensive line. And you do have some all right players around him here. Really no other standout stars, which certainly I think is what frustrated me the most about Detroit trading back from that number 6th overall selection. Like Jalen Carter would have looked so fantastic here next to Aiden Hutchinson, but as of right now, we have Alim McNeil, Isaiah Buggs, and John Comiskey slated to start at the defensive line, with Aiden Hutchinson being listed as a rush player because, let's be real, this guy's going to be just getting after the quarterback. He's going to be attacking the football. So they do have some young talent behind these guys here. Detroit is aware that their defensive line could use some improvement. They draft Broderick Martin in the 3rd round this year. They drafted Josh Paschal in the 2nd round last year, and Levi. These guys with the O last names really throw me for a loop. Almozaraik, I hope I'm saying that young man's name correctly, but 3rd-year player drafted in the 2nd round. So Detroit does have some young talent behind them here if things start to go south on the defensive line. Although I will say they would really benefit from having another standout player here alongside Aiden Hutchinson. I think back to when they had the duo of Ndamukong Suh and Nick Fairley on the defensive line for a few years there. Really short-lived, unfortunately. Those guys really should have stayed together for longer in Detroit, but I don't think they have. They didn't have the offensive line one that they have now to really help those guys out on the other side of the ball. Yes, they had Megatron and Matthew Stafford, but I think this roster as a whole, whether you look at running back, the offensive line, or even potentially this new look secondary, I think it is all superior to those Lions teams of the early 2010s. So looking now at the linebacker spot, and this is certainly where things start to get interesting for Detroit in terms of camp battles. So as of right now, Jack Campbell, the 1st-round pick from this year, is listed as the starting Mike, and I do believe he will end up winning this job by the time we get to the regular season, but I will note that in the event Jack Campbell does lose this Mike linebacker spot, it will likely be to Alex Anzalone from the New Orleans Saints, and on the instance he is the Mike linebacker, the weak side linebacker position will be a battle between Malcolm Rodriguez and Derek Barnes, although I will note in their first preseason game last week, Jack Campbell really did shine, really showed why Detroit made that 1st-round selection with him. So if I had to make a knee-jerk reaction here, I'd say Jack Campbell does end up being their starting Mike when we get to the regular season. So looking at the rest of the linebacker position here, obviously the aforementioned Anzalone will likely be the weak side linebacker with Rodriguez and Barnes backing those two up, and then Charles Harris could potentially start at the strong side linebacker position, the Sam linebacker if you will, but also a good chance they do move him to be more of a down lineman, and they could potentially have James Houston step in and produce at that Sam linebacker position, as he certainly did last season. So then finally, we'll take a quick glance at the secondary. As we mentioned, Emmanuel Mosley on the PUP list right now, although Jerry Jacobs has been putting up quite a fight for this position in camp, so even once Emmanuel Mosley does come back healthy, even though they gave him the money, this could very well be Jerry Jacobs' job when all is said and done, but competition brings out the best in everybody, and for a Detroit Lions unit that was last or one of the worst defenses in the NFL last season, certainly not a bad problem to have. On the other side, Cameron Sutton certainly figures to be their number 1 cornerback option, going up against Justin Jefferson likely when they play the Minnesota Vikings twice this year, probably getting matched up against DJ Moore on the Chicago Bears and Christian Watson when they play the Green Bay Packers. So definitely look forward to those matchups in the secondary. And then at the safety position, we have the second-year man Kirby Joseph slated to start at strong safety. Don't really think there's too much of a debate there. Kirby Joseph had a very strong rookie season last year. Starting alongside him could potentially be Tracy Walker, although CJ Gardner-Johnson could play this role. Brian Branch could play this role. Free safety on the Y, move the mouse over Kirby Joseph there. But then at the nickel cornerback position, as we mentioned, right now CJ Gardner-Johnson is slated to be the starter here, though they have been giving him some work at safety during training camp, so like I said, entirely possible they move him back to safety and Brian Branch ends up taking this nickel cornerback spot. So definitely like what Detroit's done on defense. I see what they're doing with the linebacker position, and as we look at the salary cap later on in this video, I think it'll certainly start to really, the big picture will really start to come into focus for what Detroit's plan is with building this team. But I think their secondary will be improved certainly from last year. Still a unit that leaves something to be desired for sure, but a new look unit, definitely a good step in the right direction, and look forward to seeing them on the field. Speaking of which, let's look now at Detroit's 2023 schedule, and we won't have to wait long at all to see Detroit in action. They will play the first game of the 2023 season against the Kansas City Chiefs. Definitely a curious choice on the schedule makers part of the NFL because Kansas City does have a lot of very, I guess you want to say, headlining matchups this season. You could have put the Philadelphia Eagles in the Super Bowl rematch in this spot. You could have put the Cincinnati Bengals, the Buffalo Bills in this spot, two of the best teams in the AFC, two of the big name quarterbacks in Joe Burrow and Josh Allen. Could have even put Trevor Lawrence and the Jags in this spot after that close divisional matchup last year, but or certainly could have even put Justin Herbert and the Chargers here. No, they always have to play each other twice a year. But the NFL said, you know what, we'll put Detroit in this spot. So certainly feeds into the hype train that has seemingly gone off out of control since the end of last season with the Detroit Lions. I do think after the draft, the hype train has pumped the brakes a little bit. I think a lot of people were underwhelmed by that Lions draft, but honestly, as we go through this, we'll look through the schedule and then we'll look at their salary cap situation. I think Detroit might be onto something with this draft, and I understand what they were trying to do, but we'll go through the schedule here first. Well, I do think this will be a fun season for Detroit. As of right now, I think Kansas City will just be too much for them, and I have them dropping this game. But week 2, I have them coming back at home against the Seattle Seahawks, and I think they should be able to win this matchup. Detroit very strong on the offensive line, as I mentioned. Seattle, a team that is quite weak on the defensive line. In fact, Seattle is quite weak on both sides of the trenches. If I'm being honest, no disrespect to Seattle, I do love what they've done outside of the trenches, but I think Aiden Hutchinson will be getting to Geno Smith early and often, and the Lions' offensive line will be able to give Jared Goff all the time in the world that he needs, while still giving David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs a chance to really flourish against the Seahawks defense. So Detroit goes to 1-1, and then week 2 against Desmond Ridder and the Falcons. I think Detroit should be able to handle them as well. Atlanta is a team, as I mentioned in that video, who I think might be a little bit underrated, honestly, in the NFC, but I don't think they're as good as Detroit, at least not at this point in time. So this could potentially be a shootout game. I think Atlanta will be in a lot of shootout games this season, but I think Detroit will have just a little bit more firepower to come out on top. Then they come back on a short week against the Green Bay Packers at Lambeau Field. This will certainly be a big test for Detroit to see, are they indeed in the driver's seat for the NFC North? Is this their division to lose this year? I know Minnesota is probably the team most people would expect to win this division if it's not Detroit, but I'm not going to count out Green Bay either. Green Bay is actually going to be the next video we'll do in this series, and that's one I'm really looking forward to because they really do seem like a complete mystery right now. Um, this was a team that from 2019 to 2021, 3 straight years of deep playoff runs, fantastic regular seasons, and besides trading out Aaron Rodgers for Jordan Love, and I suppose yes, losing Devontae Adams in the process, they haven't had too much turnover, and I know that those are two of their best players, if not their two best players, but they do have a pretty solid roster still from what I remember around those two guys, so definitely intrigued to see how the Packers roster looks when all is said and done, but as of right now, I will give Detroit the nod. Still early in the season, Jordan Love still might be figuring things out, so give Detroit the nod there, and another young quarterback, this time a rookie the following week against the Carolina Panthers, and I think Detroit gets this one as well at home. So Detroit now would be on a 4-game win streak coming off of that week 1 loss to Kansas City with a 4-1 record. But then in week 6, they're going to go down to Florida to take on the Tampa Bay Bucks coming off of their bye week. And Tampa Bay is another team that I'm very much looking forward to that video because I'm seeing a lot of talk about how Tampa Bay is supposed to be the worst team in the NFC South, but I'm really not a believer in that sentiment. I know they did lose Tom Brady to retirement, but if we recall to last season, the Buccaneers offense was not the strength of that team by any means. So, in fact, they were quite poor on offense last season, struggling to put up 20 points a game most weeks more often than not, whereas their defense was consistently holding teams to under 20 points from what I remember. So, they do still have a lot of the players from that 2020 Super Bowl roster, Super Bowl 55. Still have Devin White on defense, still have Antoine Winfield Jr., still have Vita Vea, still have Tristan Wirfs on that offensive line, still have Mike Evans and Chris Godwin at wide receiver. So Tampa Bay is a talented team, and I think they're going to come out with something to prove this year. Coming off of their bye week, it might just be prove to be a little bit too much for the Detroit Lions. That defense might be a valid foe for that high-powered Lions offense, but moving on to week 7, Baltimore, another one of those teams that is just loaded from top to bottom with talent. And Baltimore, as we said in that video, they really do have not many weaknesses on their roster as of right now. I do believe Detroit will win the offensive line battle against Baltimore's defensive line, but with the way Baltimore's defense is structured, they really don't rely on the defensive line too much. They kind of just want their defensive line to take the offensive linemen of the opposing team out of plays, if you will, to really set up their linebackers to make the explosive plays and get to the football. So I think that could be a troublesome matchup for the Detroit Lions, and Baltimore does have as well one of the few offensive lines that might even be better than Detroit's. I think both of those teams have top 5 units in the National Football League as of right now on the offensive line. Plus, obviously, Lamar Jackson with all those high-flying receivers going up against this Lions secondary, which isn't bad by any stretch. It certainly will be improved, but I like that matchup of Baltimore's offense against Detroit's defense very much so. So give this one to Baltimore. No sweat, though, because then the next week, Detroit's coming on a little bit of an extended week. They don't play till Monday night against the Vegas Raiders, and I really don't have a lot of confidence that the Vegas Raiders will have a great season this year. In fact, I think they'll be bottom of the AFC West. And we've already seen Josh Jacobs with the holdout. They give away Darren Waller for pennies on the dollar. Devontae Adams getting nicked up at training camp now with a minor injury. Hopefully he gets back in for their sake. And Jimmy Garoppolo signing on a waiver contract. So Jimmy Garoppolo couldn't even pass his physical. Definitely have concerns about him playing all 17 games this season. And from what it seems like, the Vegas Raiders really don't have a solid backup option at quarterback. They really don't have a solid plan B. So I think this season could get out of hand very fast, very quickly for the Vegas Raiders. And these are definitely two teams I think that are trending in opposite directions. Detroit is on the up and up, whereas Vegas, I think, is perhaps even bottoming out this season. I don't know. Things could get ugly for the Raiders. Sorry, Raiders fans. But that being said, Detroit heads into their Week 9 bye week with a 5-3 record. So definitely Not a bad record by any means. Definitely keeps them in the driver's seat of the NFC North, only playing one division game to this point. And yes, a couple of these games could go different ways. Could say, oh, well, Detroit could beat Tampa Bay, but entirely possible they could lose to Green Bay. Entirely possible they could lose to Seattle. But as of right now, I think a 5-3 record's pretty appropriate. And I mean, sure, they could beat Baltimore as well. So as of right now, I do believe Detroit will end up with a 5-3 record coming out of the bye week. And with that being said, they'll come out of the bye week with perhaps the upset of the year, at least in terms of my predictions so far, against the Los Angeles Chargers. The Chargers are one of the teams, like the Baltimore Ravens, that I think they really are stacked from head to toe on both sides of the football. Maybe the Chargers even more so than the Ravens, honestly. Really love the personnel the Chargers have put together on their roster year in and year out, but seems like for whatever reason, the Chargers, despite always having really solid rosters on paper, can never quite put it together when we get actually out on the field in the fall. So this could be a really fun game. This is a 4:05 game. I'm certainly looking forward to this one. Can't wait to watch this one on Red Zone, but right now I'll give Detroit the nod in this game, and could be a really fun one. And this could really be a game where gives Detroit a lot of confidence coming out of the bye, because this schedule coming out of this game really isn't that difficult at all. So could really propel Detroit on another second half of the season run like last season. So they followed up with two more divisional games here back to back. They have the Chicago Bears at home. I think that should be a gimme for the Detroit Lions, at least as much of a gimme as a division game can be. Then they do have a short week after that against not against the Detroit Lions. They are the Detroit Lions going up against the Green Bay Packers. And I do think the Packers end up taking this one. I think Detroit and Green Bay probably end up splitting this year. You could flip these around, if you will. Funny, they're actually both Thursday matchups. This one is on Thanksgiving, though, during the afternoon. But my reasoning for putting the Packers as the victor here as opposed to up in week 4, I think Jordan Love will really start to come into his own down here. And the Lions will be coming off of two very hard-fought games, I believe, as well. Chicago coming off of a mini bye week against the Lions here. So while I do think the Lions win this game, it will be one they're going to have to earn, even if they do end up winning it by multiple scores. And obviously with the Los Angeles Chargers, they're going to be exerting a lot of effort to win that matchup as well. So as of right now, I give Green Bay the nod here on Thanksgiving, but wouldn't be surprised at all if Detroit wins this. And I think by this point in the season, we're getting into late November now. Jordan Love should really feel comfortable playing consistently in the NFL game. I think he'll really start to feel more at ease in that Green Bay offense. He'll start to build some chemistry with some of the players there, like Christian Watson, the running backs, Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon. So I'll give Green Bay the nod there, but this could be a good matchup for sure. Then the next 2 weeks here on the road, at New Orleans, at Chicago. I think these are 2 wins. Honestly, New Orleans, this is a team that I think the opposite of Tampa Bay. I'm looking forward to this video too, because I'm seeing a lot of hype, at least NFC South hype for the New Orleans Saints, when really I don't have a lot of confidence with them just from looking at their roster. Alvin Kamara is suspended for the first few games, and they do have Jamal Williams, so this will be a Jamal Williams revenge game, if you will, but I don't love what New Orleans has in the trenches on either side of the football. They just went out and paid Derek Carr a ton of money Derek Carr is a fine player, and he wore his heart on his sleeve for the Vegas Raiders for several seasons, even dating back to their time in Oakland, but I don't know. I'm just not a believer in this New Orleans Saints squad right now, and I think Detroit's able to take this one with relative ease. And then following it up, they get the rematch with Justin Fields and the Bears coming off of their bye week. So the Bears actually get a little bit of rest both times here against the Lions, but despite that, I do have the Lions sweeping the Chicago Bears. Certainly this matchup in Week 14, Chicago could put up even more of a fight than they did in Week 11. It'll be at Soldier Field in mid-December, so certainly going to be pretty frigid temperatures out there. Detroit, a dome team coming into that setting. Be interested to see how that plays out, but do believe Detroit is just the better team still at this point, so I'll give them the nod as of right now. Then moving on from that, they go up against the Denver Broncos, and as we just discussed in the Denver video, I think this is going to be a big game for the Broncos in terms of they might be facing their fate here of if they lose this game, their season could very well be over. So I give Denver the nod here. Detroit is coming off of a pretty nice little run here with victories in 5 of their last 6 games. So definitely nothing to be upset about with Detroit there. They're still very much in the driver's seat in the NFC North, but that sets us up for a fascinating finish. So Detroit has yet to play the Minnesota Vikings. They will not play the Minnesota Vikings until Christmas Eve. So for a team that has to play them twice, that's pretty remarkable that we're going to go 15 out of 18 weeks and these two teams won't even face each other. And it'd be really incredible if these two end up facing each other in the wild card round as well, playing each other potentially 3 weeks out of 4. That wouldn't that be something? But I think like with the Green Bay Packers, the Vikings and the Lions will split. Conditions won't really be too much of a factor here. Both the Lions and the Vikings play in domes, of course. So I gave the victory to both the home teams here in Week 16 and Week 18. But I mean, if you want to mix and match these and give it to the road teams, I wouldn't really bat an eye at that. But I would be surprised to see this series be a sweep one way or the other. I feel Minnesota and Detroit are probably pretty evenly matched at this point. I would say Detroit probably is the slightly more talented team, but can never count out a team with Justin Jefferson on it. So, and the Vikings, of course, do have experience with winning the NFC North, so you can never discount that either. I give the Vikings and the Lions a split here. And then Week 17 against the Dallas Cowboys. I do believe Dallas's defense will just be too much for the Detroit Lions offense, even with that terrific offensive line. Dallas boasts one of the best defenses from front to back in all of the National Football League. Micah Parsons, one of those few young defensive players who I would say is better than Aiden Hutchinson. So I give Dallas the nod in this one, but again, that's not the end of the world for Detroit because they do end up finishing with a 10-7 record, which would put them at third place in the NFC. Unfortunate Minnesota finishes 7th, so we just narrowly miss out on seeing those two match up for 3 times in 4 weeks. So who knows? Maybe Minnesota could end up as the 6th seed, or Detroit ends up as the 2 seed, or maybe this ends up being the 4-5 matchup. Who knows? But man, now that I'm seeing this, I really am rooting for the Lions and Vikings to play each other in the wild card round because I don't know if that's something we've ever seen in NFL history. But what's Detroit going to do in the playoffs once they get in? This will be their first home playoff game at Ford Field, if I'm recalling correctly. So certainly something exciting for Lions fans. They get a Week 2 rematch with the Seattle Seahawks. And while I do like the matchup of Detroit's defense against that Seattle offensive line, it is going to be a tricky matchup for Detroit in terms of Seattle's skill position players. So they do have the three-headed monster wide receiver now with DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and the newly drafted Jackson Smith-Njigba. And then the backfield, assuming they're both healthy, they do boast the duo of Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. So while Seattle does have a little bit of a suspect offensive line, and think what you will about Geno Smith as the quarterback, I do think Seattle will be very well coached coming into this game. Pete Carroll's going to make sure the guys get up for this matchup. They have the skill position players to definitely outmatch Detroit's defense. Aiden Hutchinson and company will certainly have put up a fight against the Seattle Seahawks unit, but I don't know, because you're going to put, like, you can only really try to take out one of those skill position players. You have to worry about DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and Jackson Smith-Njigba after a full rookie season. This isn't like Jackson Smith-Njigba just in Week 2, just getting into the NFL, but man, I don't know. This could be a really fun playoff matchup. If it's not Lions versus Vikings with the third matchup in 4 weeks, this is certainly one that could be really interesting. Would not be surprised at all if Detroit does win this game either. I love the matchup of Detroit's offensive line against Seattle's defensive line, as I mentioned in the Week 2 matchup, and I like Detroit on the other side of the trenches, honestly, with Aiden Hutchinson going up against that offensive line, but we will see as the season goes on. This might not even be the playoff matchup, but definitely think Detroit's one of the elites in the NFC, to say the least. The three best teams in the NFC, I would say, are certainly the Philadelphia Eagles, the Dallas Cowboys, and the San Francisco 49ers. But unlike the AFC, where I think the AFC really is like 12 teams deep, it's potentially even more than that. I'd be hard pressed to find teams in the AFC that I think are truly out of contention. The only teams in the AFC, honestly, I think that have no shot of the postseason are Vegas, Indianapolis, and Houston. I think pretty much everybody else in the AFC is completely fair game to make the playoffs, whereas I look at the NFC, it's kind of the opposite problem. A lot of teams could make the playoffs, but that's just because there's really not a teams I have a ton of confidence in. The only teams I really do have a lot of confidence in are the Eagles, Cowboys, and 49ers, but that leaves an avenue wide open for a team like Detroit, who I think is trending in the right direction, whereas some of the other teams in postseason contention last year, like the Minnesota Vikings and Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and even the New York Giants, I think are trending in the wrong direction right now. So certainly interested to see how Detroit's season shapes out. Looking at Detroit's cap real quick, this is where I really start to see Detroit's big picture come into fruition. So they do have Jared Goff on 2 more years, locked up at right around 31 million, and it is quite funny how when the Matthew Stafford for Jared Goff trade went down in 2021, the narrative was, oh well, Los Angeles had to pretty much pay Detroit to take Jared Goff's contract, which is pretty comical now because you could argue from a pure statistics standpoint, Jared Goff was a top 5 quarterback in the NFL last year. I know some people might laugh at that, but I mean, it's true. He played all 17 games and had a pretty impressive stat line. Passing as a whole was surprisingly down for quarterbacks last season, but he signed at just 31 million. And when you look at teams like the New York Giants and New Orleans Saints paying Daniel Jones and Derek Carr north of $40 million per season, no disrespect to those two gentlemen, but I would rather have Jared Goff, certainly at $10 million less a season, and that gives Detroit so much more flexibility to be able to build up this roster around them. Certainly things will be interesting when we get to 2025. Hendon Hooker will be in his third year by then. If they have confidence in him, could potentially step in there as an option, but who knows? We really have to see, but as of right now, I love this Jared Goff contract. I think they're really in a great spot with him. So moving on, looking at the running back spot, and again, this is where I think Detroit, they're kind of sneaky smart with taking Jahmyr Gibbs in the first round because they do have him locked up at a very reasonable cap hit for 4 years, plus a potential fifth-year club option, paired alongside David Montgomery, who signed for 3 seasons at, again, a pretty manageable cap hit as well, as at the height of that deal, he's making just north of $7 million. So not a lot of money invested in the running back position, getting tremendous value at the quarterback position. So far, so great for the Lions when it comes to the cap. And then looking at the wide receiver spot, they really have nothing invested here. They have Amon-Ra St. Brown signed for the next 2 seasons, making pennies on the dollar for what he's worth. He's slated to become a free agent in 2025, although I'm sure Detroit is going to give him a substantial raise here. Just based on how his career's gone so far, $20 million should be the start of the conversation for Amon-Ra St. Brown. Much deserved there. Then Jameson Williams signed for the next 3 seasons, plus a potential club option for 2026. And they have, there he is, Marvin Jones, just signed for this season at a little bit north of $2 million. So not really a lot invested in the wide receiver position either. Then looking at tight end, they take Sam Laporta in the second round this year. He signed for the next 4 years at a very reasonable cap hit. So while the Detroit Lions didn't necessarily take the typical positions for first round players and second round players in this past year's draft, as we go along, you start to see where their head's at. It's because they don't want to have those players having large salary cap hits, but they still want production from those positions. I think that's what's really getting lost with a lot of these teams. We look at a lot of these teams, especially like just off the top of my head, thinking about a team like, say, Buffalo, for example, with the running back spot, or the Baltimore Ravens or the Chicago Bears, teams we've covered already, who have the mobile quarterbacks, but they don't invest in the running back position. Sure, you don't want to invest in the running back position because you don't want to have a lot of your salary cap spent there. But that shouldn't come at the cost of you not having a quality back, or at least not having a quality backfield. I think that's something Detroit's aware of, and they have a fantastic duo here of Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery at a very reasonable cap hit. They're looking at the tight end spot. The Bears are paying Cole Kmet a ton of money over the next few seasons. The Lions have Sam Laporta on a pretty bargain contract here for the next 4 years. And what's that open the door for them to do? Look at the offensive line. This is where they're able to spend the money now. They have the talent in place already on the offensive line, so they don't need to go out and draft these guys in the first round. They can just use the cap space they have to extend these guys. They don't have to worry about letting them walk in free agency and having to replace them. Definitely some wise decision making by Detroit's front office in this regard. So Taylor Decker's signed for the next 2 seasons before a void year in 2025. I imagine they end up extending him here as well. He's still, I would say he's in his prime right now. He's not necessarily a young player anymore, but certainly not an old player by any means. And Frank Ragnow locked up for the next 4 seasons. Penei Sewell, another 2 years at a reasonable cap hit, plus a potential 2025 option. Then you have both of their guards plus Big V all just in a contract year this year. So it gives Detroit a lot of flexibility. They can pick and choose who they want to extend here. Or if they don't want to extend any of them, they could let them all walk and address it in the draft next season. But it won't really matter too much because they already have their tackles and their centers locked up and still have a ton of cap space to play with. So looking now at the defense, the defensive line, Aiden Hutchinson, very reasonable cap hit for the next 3 seasons, plus a potential 4th-year option. Really not a lot of money tied up elsewhere here either. Charles Harris in a contract year, John Comiskey signed for just the next 2 seasons. Nobody else making north of $3 million. Like, Detroit is just really not investing a ton of money here at all, so it gives them a lot of flexibility going forward. And this is a roster, as we said, figures to win the NFC North this year, or at the very least make the NFC playoffs. Then moving along to linebacker, again, Jack Campbell now, the rookie, signed to a 4-year deal plus a potential 5th-year option. If he can step in and be a leader of this defense and be a solid Mike linebacker for him, we're not going to look back and say, oh, well, yeah, Jack Campbell, he's a great linebacker and really helped Detroit win that Super Bowl, but man, they could have gotten him in the second round that season. Nobody's going to say that because they have him as potentially a star of this defense going forward at a very reasonable cap hit, and they could even have him on an option for 2027. So, love that. They won't have to go out and spend big money on a free agent at the linebacker position now. Then looking at the rest of the linebacker position, Romeo Okwara signed for just this season. Alex Anzalone signed for the next 3. But even then, he's the highest cap hit here at just over $7 million. So not a ton of money invested here either. Then finally looking at the secondary. Again, really not a lot of money invested here. Let's look at the top here. So Detroit, they do have $218 million on the cap this year, but I'm really wondering where that's coming from because I'm not seeing a lot of guys who are making a ton of money here. But looking beyond this season, only $195 million next season with already 52 players on the roster. Then in 2025, it plummets to just $108 million. So they have more. They're going to have more cap space in 2025 than players they already have signed. So definitely a good place to be. And this is quite the opposite of a team like the Buffalo Bills, who, looking at their salary cap situation, they do have a really good roster right now, but they're going to have to make some tough decisions over the next few years, where I think Detroit is the opposite. They're going to be able to extend the players they already have in-house and really be able to build off of this thing. So they already have the positions like running back, linebacker, tight end locked up on long-term deals at a cheap salary cap figure. So if they want to go out and sign a big name guy for the secondary next season, they could. They already technically have been with Cameron Sutton and Emmanuel Mosley, but it could open the door for them to potentially get another quarterback if Jared Goff doesn't prove to be the answer here long term. They don't want to extend him beyond 2024, or potentially if they want to go out and get him another wide receiver, or if they want to beef up this defensive line, which I think really, if I had to make a prediction, this is where Detroit addresses next. They want to put somebody next to Aiden Hutchinson here to really round out this roster, because the rest of it looks like it's really coming into its own. So hats off to Detroit's front office in that regard. Finally, before we wrap up, we'll look at Detroit's future draft pick situation. So, no, Detroit does not have 2 first-round picks again this season like they did the last 2 seasons, but they do have 2 third-round picks by way of their division rival, the Minnesota Vikings, who they traded TJ Hawkinson at the trade deadline last year, of course. In exchange, they get another third-round pick in the 2024 draft, although they do give up a 2024 fourth in the process. So they have a first, second, 2 thirds, no fourths, and then a fifth, sixth, and a seventh. So definitely would like to see Detroit address the defensive line here, but of course you always just take the best player on the board. And then in 2025, they have a 4th round pick from the Eagles for DeAndre Swift, and then potentially trading a 6th round pick to the New York Jets if Denzel Mims makes the roster. And then a potential conditional 7th in 2026, but seems to be quite an unknown there. So that's all I've really got on the Detroit Lions. I would love to hear from any Lions fans out there. Detroit, certainly one of those sports cities I feel is certainly sort of an unsung 4-for-4 sports town. They do have all 4 teams, of course, but over the last decade, none of those 4 have really particularly had a lot of success. The Lions, of course, having a long-time reputation as lovable losers, but we do love them, and I would love to see them succeed. They are one of only 4 teams in the NFL that has never even played in the Super Bowl, so certainly like to see that sometime in the 2020s here as this team continues to develop. Who knows? Things in the NFL just seem to happen so much quicker than we anticipate, so it could happen a lot sooner than we anticipate, but I think for this season, safe bet would be Detroit wins the NFC North at the very least, and we get to see our first playoff action at Ford Field. So, love to hear from any Detroit fans down below. How do you think the Lions do this season? What do you think about that Jameson Williams suspension? Can the Lions win the NFC North? How do you feel about Jared Goff as the quarterback going forward? How do you feel about the secondary, the changes they've made there? Definitely love to hear it. So, look forward to talking to you guys in the next video where we will stay right in the NFC North discussing none other than Jordan Love and the Green Bay Packers. Look forward to talking to you then. Have a good one.